I'm not surprised that MAGA in particular and MAGA folks are angry with Wiles, but I think that's more of a reflection on the president's job in office than what Susie Wiles is doing behind closed doors to keep everything running smoothly.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by White House reporter Christian Datoc. And Christian, you've written a story about Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff, and I think a lot of people credit her with how much more efficiently, by Trumpian standards, the second Trump term has gone. There's been a lack of public infighting, at least compared to the first term. A lot of people inside and around the White House have positive things to say about her, but there are some outside activists that maybe are blaming her for how things are going, not really necessarily delivering on some populist goals. What's going on there?
Well, there has been sort of a groundswell of opposition to Susie Wiles' role in the Trump White House. Of course, the Chief of Staff is arguably the most important person in 1600 Pennsylvania, other than the president himself, because she does not come from the quote-unquote loyalist MAGA wing of the Republican Party. She is full-on an establishment operative, right? She was a Republican lobbyist down in Florida for forever. She worked for Ron DeSantis, she worked for George W. Bush, but that's not to say, I do think she has done a sort of a remarkable job about keeping the trains running on time in this second term for President Trump. I think the fury that's popped up over the last several weeks has to do not necessarily with Susie Wiles' own performance, but instead sort of, a negative sentiment aimed at the president on any number of issues. It has to do with, one, the delayed release of the Epstein files. It has to do with the Republican losses in the November elections. But in particular, the MAGA cadre of President Trump's supporters are angry because they believe Susie Wiles and a couple of other senior administration officials who we'll get into are specifically blocking RFK Jr. from implementing the quote-unquote MAGA agenda over at HHS, and they think she needs to go. But at the same time, I'm talking to a lot of folks within Trump world who are telling me, look, this is typical of a chief of staff, right? Especially around this time when we're heading into the midterm election cycle, where the in-government party receives a little bit of negative blowback compared to, when the president was sworn into office. But you can't get mad at the president, right? So who do you get mad at? His chief of staff. And I do think Susie Wiles is safe. She's already outlasted Reince Priebus, the president's first chief of staff from his first term in office, who, like Wiles, really was an establishment Republican as opposed to some of the other senior advisors at the White House. I think it was one longtime Trump advisor who sort of joked to me, if Susie Wiles gets fired, you need to start stocking up on ammunition and gold because it's a bad sign of things to come. So I'm not surprised that MAGA in particular and MAGA folks are angry with Wiles, but I think that's more of a reflection on the president's job in office than what Susie Wiles is doing behind closed doors to keep everything running smoothly.
Well, there's also, it's part of the job of the White House Chief of Staff to function as a kind of a gatekeeper.
Oh, yeah.
And anybody who is being kept out as a result of that gatekeeping process is going to be unhappy about it and may start to spout off about it. But obviously one of the criticisms of Mark Meadows, President Trump's last White House Chief of Staff during his first term, was that he didn't do a good enough job keeping people out of the president's ear who maybe influenced him to make some bad decisions that sort of cast a pall over the end of his term.
Yeah, that's true. And I think to this point, Wiles has done a pretty good job of, I don't want to say limiting the information flow to the president, but making sure that proposals and ideas that are coming from his circle of advisors, whether they are senior administration staff or some of these out-of-government folks that the president frequently seeks advice from, these ideas are being vetted properly. They are being scrutinized for the legality, but also the practicality and the real-world implications of trying to carry this out. And I think an interesting example of where Wiles might be slipping is what we saw with Bill Pulte, the president's federal housing director. Obviously, affordability has been a big issue coming out of the November elections. We've heard about the housing crisis even before Trump was sworn into office. This was a big campaign promise of former Vice President Kamala Harris. She's going to bring down prices for first-time home buyers.
Right.
But Mr. Pulte, he was able to get into a meeting with the president at Mar-a-Lago about 2 weeks ago, and all it took him was 10 minutes to convince him that a 50-year mortgage plan is a good idea. So obviously it's impossible for any chief of staff to catch all the bad ideas, coming through the sieve of policy information
Right.
Before they hit the president's desk. But that was sort of an unforced error, and the White House is dealing with it, right? I mean, that idea was lambasted, not just by Democrats, but even by some staunch fiscal conservatives who say, not only is this, a numbskull idea, it's actually going to make the problem a lot worse because it's going to double the interest payments for folks who take on these longer loans down the line. It's just going to make it that much harder to own a home outright. So I do think Wiles will probably clean it up. I mean, let's be honest, she's not nicknamed the Ice Maiden for no reason, right? She's particularly effective, and I think more so than any establishment figure, she's shown she's been able to get these MAGA folks in line and all focused on making sure Donald Trump can govern in the most popular and the most effective way possible. Again, the president himself is the big elephant in the room here, right? Will he allow Wiles to sort of, I don't want to say control him, but point him in the right direction from behind the scenes? Or will he slip into some of these baser tendencies that, like you pointed out, kind of really sank his first term in office, rather?
Mm-hmm. How much does some of this also just reflect divisions within MAGA? I mean, you have differences of opinion within the coalition. You have some people within the coalition who don't feel they've been as effectively represented by the administration. You also have people, now that Trump is term limited out of office, jockeying for position and leadership roles in what could become a post-Trump world, at least a post-Trump presidency world. Is that some of what we're seeing play out here?
I think that's totally what we're seeing play out here. And I think this dynamic, a lot of us in Washington sort of expected it to play out after the midterm elections, when you could see, how popular are the president's policies in reality, and will Republicans be able to maintain control of both chambers of Congress, one, the Senate or the House perhaps, and based on those results, we need to figure out how to fashion a coalition that can move forward and be competitive in 2028. I think one of the big misconceptions about MAGA is that there is this, written down doctrine that all of the president's voters adhere to, and that the president himself adheres to, right? But in reality, MAGA really just is Donald Trump, right? He's sort of the sauce, the special sauce that makes this dish work, because to be quite frank, the MAGA coalition, oftentimes these are groups where their interests are like diametrically opposed, right? You've got the isolationist foreign policy folks voting in line with these, big time hawkish foreign policy experts, a la Lindsey Graham, right? And I just think it's going to be difficult for any Republican, whether it's J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio. We're hearing, rumors of Ted Cruz potentially preparing another 2028 bid.
There have been rumors about Ron DeSantis
Exactly,
again.
yeah. It's going to be incredibly difficult for any of those men to maintain the same coalition, because I think no one would disagree with me. Donald Trump is such a hugely charismatic figure, whether you like him or you hate him.
Right.
And I just don't think any of those guys necessarily bring the same juice, or at least the same ability to weather negative headlines that get thrown out at him and spin them in a way which actually makes my support stronger, like President Trump has demonstrated to us over the last decade.
Thank you, Christian.
Anytime, Jim.
You can read Christian and the rest of our politics team's coverage at WashingtonExaminer.com.